Never touch me in public. Those were the words Ethan Carter said to his wife the night their marriage quietly began to break apart. And no one in that glittering ballroom had any idea that just 3 months later the same man would lose every ounce of composure the moment he saw her with someone else. Manhattan's Winter Gala was the kind of event where the city's wealthiest people gathered beneath chandeliers the size of small cars, dressed in tuxedos and gowns that probably cost more than most Americans earned in a month. Ethan Carter stood among them like he always did, calm, composed, and completely in control. At 35 years old, he was already one of the most talked-about tech millionaires in the country, the founder of Carter Dynamics, a company that had transformed artificial intelligence into a billion-dollar empire. Investors admired him, business magazines called him a genius, and competitors feared how little emotion he showed when making decisions. Standing beside him that night was his wife, Olivia Carter, a woman who seemed almost invisible in comparison to the power surrounding her. She wore a simple silver dress that reflected the soft light of the ballroom, her long hair resting neatly across her shoulders, her smile polite but careful as she greeted people who seemed far more interested in Ethan than in her. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect couple, a successful millionaire and the elegant woman who stood quietly beside him. But what no one in that room knew was that their marriage had never truly been about love. 2 years earlier, their wedding had been arranged through a quiet agreement between families that had business interests tied together. Ethan needed stability for his rapidly growing company, and Olivia's family needed the financial protection that came with the Carter name. It was a practical arrangement, efficient and calculated, exactly the kind of decision Ethan Carter excelled at making. There had been rules from the beginning, simple rules that kept their relationship structured and uncomplicated. They would appear together at important events, maintain a respectable public image, and avoid anything that suggested emotional dependency. Ethan believed emotions complicated things, and he preferred a life where everything stayed under control. For Olivia, the rules had seemed manageable at first. She told herself that respect and kindness would grow into something warmer over time. She believed that if she supported him quietly and never caused problems, maybe one day he would begin to see her as more than just part of an arrangement. And for a while she tried her best to fit perfectly into the life he had built. She attended charity dinners, smiled during interviews, and learned how to stand gracefully beside one of the most powerful men in the room without asking for attention. But that night at the Manhattan Gala, something small happened that revealed the truth about their marriage more clearly than any contract ever could. As Ethan moved through the ballroom, greeting investors and executives, Olivia followed closely behind him. The marble floor near the stage had been polished so smooth it reflected the light like glass, and as she stepped forward her heels slipped slightly. Instinctively she reached out and gently touched Ethan's arm to steady herself. It was a simple, natural gesture, the kind most married couples would not even notice. Ethan noticed immediately. He stopped walking. His expression did not change, but his hand moved calmly to remove hers from his sleeve. Then he leaned slightly closer, so only she could hear his voice. "Never touch me in public." The words were quiet, controlled, almost emotionless. Olivia froze for a moment, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing her face before she nodded softly, as if nothing unusual had happened. Around them, the music continued, glasses clinked, and conversations carried on without interruption. No one realized that something important had just shifted between them. Ethan returned to greeting guests as if nothing had happened, confident that the situation was handled. What he did not realize was that somewhere deep inside Olivia Carter, the woman who had spent 2 years trying to be the perfect wife, something fragile had finally begun to break. And Ethan Carter, the man who believed he controlled everything in his world, had no idea that the quiet distance beginning in that moment would soon lead him to a night he would never forget, a night when he would walk into a restaurant across the city and see his wife sitting across from another man, smiling in a way he had never once seen before. 3 days after the gala, life inside the Carter penthouse returned to the same quiet rhythm it had always followed, the kind of silence that felt polished and expensive but strangely empty. The apartment sat nearly 40 floors above Central Park, with glass walls that revealed miles of Manhattan skyline, glowing every night. To most people it would have looked like a dream home, the kind of place featured in luxury magazines with marble floors, minimalist furniture, and a view worth millions of dollars. But for Olivia Carter, it often felt less like a home and more like a carefully designed waiting room. Ethan Carter left early every morning, usually before the city traffic became loud enough to echo between the skyscrapers. His schedule rarely changed. By 7 o'clock, he was already reviewing reports from Carter Dynamics, scanning financial updates, and answering messages from executives across the country. Olivia would sometimes wake before him just to watch him move through the apartment with that same calm efficiency that defined everything he did. Even at home, Ethan behaved like a man running a company rather than a husband sharing a life. There were polite conversations over breakfast, brief discussions about upcoming events, and occasional questions about charity functions she planned to attend, but there was never anything personal that lasted long. 2 years earlier, when they signed the agreement that made their marriage official, the arrangement had seemed logical to both families involved. Ethan gained the image of a stable married businessman, something investors appreciated when evaluating a young company expanding rapidly across the technology industry. Olivia's family gained security through business partnerships that protected their financial interests. The agreement itself had been written with precise language, clear expectations, and boundaries designed to prevent emotional complications. Ethan believed boundaries made life simpler. One rule had been explained very clearly on the first evening they moved into the penthouse together. Their relationship would remain respectful but private, and there would be no displays of affection in public that might create unnecessary attention. At the time, Olivia had accepted the rule without hesitation. She believed trust and patience might slowly turn the arrangement into something warmer, something closer to the kind of marriage most people imagined. For the first year, she tried hard to make that possibility real. She learned Ethan's schedule, remembered his preferences, and quietly supported the public life that surrounded him. She attended corporate galas, charity auctions, and industry celebrations where cameras flashed and reporters asked polite questions about the impressive young couple. Ethan always introduced her with the same calm courtesy. "This is my wife, Olivia." She appreciated that he never spoke to her harshly and never embarrassed her in front of others. But kindness was not the same thing as closeness, and after 2 years she had begun to notice the difference. Even inside their own home, Ethan rarely sat beside her for long. His attention moved constantly between business calls, financial projections, and strategic plans for the company that demanded nearly every hour of his day. On evenings when he returned late from meetings, Olivia would sometimes be reading near the window overlooking the city lights. Ethan would greet her politely, ask if the day had been comfortable, and then disappear into his office to continue working. She had stopped expecting long conversations. What she had not expected was how quiet the distance between them could become. The memory of that moment at the gala lingered in her mind more than she wanted to admit. The way Ethan had calmly removed her hand from his arm, the quiet firmness of his voice, the reminder that their connection had limits. Olivia told herself that nothing had really changed because the rule had always existed. But something inside her had shifted. It was not anger or resentment. It was simply the realization that she had spent 2 years trying to build warmth in a place designed to remain emotionally controlled. And somewhere beyond the windows of the Carter penthouse, in a city filled with millions of strangers living unpredictable lives, a small change was beginning to grow in Olivia Carter's heart, a change that Ethan Carter had not yet noticed, a change that would soon introduce someone new into the quiet space between them. About 2 weeks after the gala, Olivia Carter began spending more time outside the penthouse, though no one would have noticed the change at first. From the outside, her life still appeared exactly the same. She attended the same charity meetings, visited the same museums, and occasionally met friends for lunch along the Upper East Side. But internally, something subtle had shifted. Instead of waiting for Ethan to return in the evenings, she started filling her days with small routines that belonged entirely to her. One cool Thursday afternoon, she decided to walk through Bryant Park after leaving a fundraising planning session nearby. The air carried the early scent of autumn, and office workers filled the outdoor tables while the sounds of the city moved like a steady current around them. Olivia found a quiet bench near the fountain and sat for a moment watching people pass by, couples holding coffee cups, friends laughing, strangers sharing the same sunlight without ever learning each other's names. It had been a long time since she had simply sat in the middle of the city with no schedule attached to her time. After a few minutes, she realized the cafe beside the park had an open table and decided to step inside for coffee. The place was modest compared to the restaurants she usually visited for business events, but the warmth of the room felt inviting in a way the grand ballrooms of Manhattan never did. Olivia ordered a simple latte and sat near the window where the afternoon light filtered through the glass. She had just opened a book she had been carrying when a man standing near the counter accidentally dropped a folder of architectural sketches across the floor. Papers scattered across the cafe tiles and drifted toward her table. Without thinking, Olivia leaned down to gather them before the breeze from the open door could carry them farther away. When she handed the papers back to him, he looked slightly embarrassed but grateful. His name, he explained with an easy smile, was Daniel Brooks. He was an architect working on the renovation of an older building several blocks away, and the sketches represented a design proposal he had spent weeks preparing. Olivia noticed the drawings were detailed and elegant, full of careful lines that transformed old structures into bright modern spaces. Daniel spoke with the relaxed confidence of someone who enjoyed his work rather than someone chasing recognition. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes at first, mostly polite comments about the city and the building he was restoring, but there was something unexpectedly comfortable about the interaction. Daniel listened attentively when Olivia mentioned she had always loved historic architecture in Manhattan, and he described how some of the city's older buildings carried stories hidden behind their stone facades. Before leaving, he thanked her again for helping gather the papers and joked that the project might have collapsed before construction even started if those drawings had disappeared. Olivia smiled at the humor and wished him luck with the renovation. It was such a small encounter that it barely registered as important at the time. She finished her coffee, walked back into the park, and continued with her afternoon as usual. But as she moved through the city streets, she realized something she had not felt in a long while. The conversation had been simple, polite, and completely ordinary, yet it carried a warmth she had almost forgotten existed. Meanwhile, several miles away inside the glass tower that housed Carter Dynamics, Ethan Carter was concluding a meeting with investors from California. His focus remained firmly on expansion strategies and financial projections, unaware that the quiet space between his carefully organized life and the woman waiting at home had just welcomed the first unexpected presence. During the following week, Olivia Carter unexpectedly found herself walking past the same cafe near Bryant Park more than once, though she never admitted to herself that the reason had anything to do with the conversation she had shared there. Manhattan was filled with thousands of small cafes, bookstores, and restaurants, so returning to one familiar place did not seem unusual. Still, the simple warmth she had experienced that afternoon lingered quietly in her thoughts. On a mild Saturday morning, she decided to stop there again after visiting a nearby art gallery that had recently opened an exhibition of modern photography. The streets were busy with weekend visitors and the steady movement of taxis and buses. Inside the cafe, the same gentle music played through the speakers, and sunlight streamed through the large windows facing the park. Olivia ordered coffee and chose a table near the window, expecting nothing more than a quiet moment before continuing with her day. She had just begun reading when a familiar voice greeted her with pleasant surprise. Daniel Brooks stood beside the table holding another folder of architectural drawings, looking slightly amused as if the coincidence felt remarkable to him as well. He joked that perhaps the city had decided they should meet again so he could properly thank her for rescuing his project plans the previous week. Olivia laughed softly at the idea and invited him to sit for a few minutes if he had time. Their conversation quickly became more relaxed than before. Daniel explained that the renovation project he mentioned earlier involved restoring an early 20th century building that had once been a small theater before it was converted into offices decades ago. He described the challenge of preserving the historical details while transforming the structure into something useful for modern businesses. Olivia listened with genuine interest as he spread several sketches across the table, pointing out how natural light would enter through restored windows and how the interior space could feel open without losing the charm of the original design. What surprised her most was how naturally the conversation flowed. Daniel asked thoughtful questions about her interests, and when she mentioned that she enjoyed visiting museums and historic buildings, he spoke enthusiastically about how architecture carried the memory of a city's past. The discussion lasted nearly 40 minutes before Daniel checked his watch and realized he needed to return to the construction site across town. Before leaving, he thanked her again for the pleasant company and said that conversations like this were a rare break from the stress of deadlines and contractors. Olivia wished him luck with the project and watched him leave the cafe with the same calm energy he carried during their first meeting. Later that evening inside the Carter penthouse, the quiet routine of the household continued as usual. Ethan Carter returned shortly after 8 o'clock following a long meeting with the board of directors. Olivia greeted him politely and asked whether his day had gone well. Ethan responded with the same composed tone he always used, explaining that the company was preparing for a major expansion into international markets. He spoke briefly about investors in London and upcoming negotiations before opening his laptop to review additional reports. Olivia listened patiently, nodding when appropriate, but something felt subtly different inside her. Earlier that afternoon, she had shared a conversation filled with curiosity and laughter, something that had not existed in her life for quite some time. Now, sitting across from Ethan in the quiet dining area overlooking the city lights, she realized how rarely they spoke about anything beyond business schedules and public appearances. Ethan did not notice the difference. His attention remained focused on the numbers glowing across the screen in front of him. Yet somewhere within the comfortable silence of that expensive apartment, a quiet emotional distance continued to widen, and Olivia Carter began to understand that the world beyond the penthouse contained experiences she had slowly stopped expecting from the man she had married. Over the next several days, the rhythm of Olivia Carter's life continued to change in ways that were almost impossible for anyone else to notice. Yet for her, the difference felt quietly significant. The city of Manhattan had always been busy around her, filled with endless movement and noise. But for the first time in a long while, she began to feel as if she were truly part of that movement, instead of simply observing it from the glass walls of the Carter penthouse. On a bright Tuesday afternoon, she received a short message from Daniel Brooks, thanking her again for their conversation at the cafe and mentioning that the renovation project he had described was entering an exciting phase. He explained that the original theater balcony had been rediscovered behind a layer of old office construction, and that restoring it would bring back a piece of New York history that had been hidden for decades. Olivia read the message with a small smile, because Daniel's enthusiasm felt sincere and refreshing compared to the business language she heard so often around Ethan. After a moment, she replied politely, wishing him success with the restoration and mentioning that the project sounded fascinating. To her mild surprise, Daniel responded almost immediately, explaining that the construction site allowed visitors during the daytime and that she would be welcome to see the building if she ever wanted to observe how the design was developing. Olivia hesitated for a moment because accepting such an invitation felt slightly unusual within the structured life she had been living for the past 2 years. Yet the idea of seeing a historic building slowly return to life sparked genuine curiosity inside her. 2 days later, she found herself standing on a quiet street several blocks away from Midtown, where the renovation project was taking place. The structure itself was taller than she expected, built from warm-colored brick with elegant stone arches above the windows. Daniel greeted her near the entrance wearing a simple work jacket instead of the relaxed clothing she had seen at the cafe, but his friendly energy remained the same. As they walked through the interior, he explained how the building had originally opened as a small theater almost 100 years earlier, before being converted into office space during the 1970s. Dust covered some areas where the construction crews were carefully removing layers of drywall and old ceiling panels, but beneath the unfinished surfaces, Olivia could see the beauty Daniel had described. He pointed out decorative molding that had been hidden for decades and explained how the restored balcony would overlook a modern co-working space designed to encourage creativity. Olivia listened with growing fascination, occasionally asking questions about the design process and the challenges of balancing preservation with modern functionality. Daniel answered every question with patient enthusiasm, clearly enjoying the chance to share his vision with someone who appreciated the details. Nearly an hour passed before Olivia realized how easily time had slipped away during the tour. When she thanked Daniel for showing her the building, he smiled and admitted that it had been refreshing to speak with someone who noticed the small artistic elements rather than just the financial value of the project. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan Carter remained completely focused on the expansion of Carter Dynamics. That same afternoon, he was attending a strategy meeting with senior executives discussing a partnership that could push the company's technology into new international markets. Charts, forecasts, and legal documents filled the conference room as the conversation moved steadily toward profit projections and long-term growth. Ethan listened carefully to every detail with the same calm intensity that had built his reputation in the business world. Yet somewhere beyond those glass office walls, Olivia Carter was experiencing something simple but meaningful, a conversation that carried genuine warmth and interest, a moment that slowly began to reshape how she saw her own place within the vast city surrounding them both. During the weeks that followed, Olivia Carter began to develop a routine that slowly pulled her further into the rhythm of the city beyond the quiet walls of the penthouse. Her visits to the renovation site did not happen every day, but Daniel Brooks occasionally sent short messages updating her about the progress of the project, and whenever her schedule allowed, she would stop by to see how the transformation was unfolding. Each visit revealed something new. One afternoon, the workers carefully uncovered a set of old wooden balcony seats that had survived nearly a century, hidden behind layers of office construction. Another day's sunlight streamed through newly restored windows that had once been covered by thick interior walls. Daniel spoke about the building as if it were a living story gradually returning to life, and Olivia found herself enjoying those conversations more than she expected. The calm enthusiasm in his voice made even small architectural details feel meaningful. Meanwhile, the pace of Ethan Carter's professional life continued to accelerate. Carter Dynamics was preparing to announce a major partnership with a European technology group, and the negotiations demanded nearly every hour of Ethan's attention. His days were filled with strategy meetings, legal consultations, and conference calls that stretched across multiple time zones. When he returned to the penthouse each evening, he often carried the quiet exhaustion of someone whose mind never truly left the office. Olivia greeted him with the same polite warmth she had always shown, asking about his meetings and listening carefully as he explained the progress of the company. Yet their conversations remained brief, structured around schedules and upcoming public appearances rather than personal thoughts. One evening, as Ethan reviewed documents at the dining table, Olivia mentioned that she had visited a building renovation downtown that afternoon. She described how the restoration of the historic balcony had revealed beautiful craftsmanship hidden for decades. Ethan listened politely, but his focus remained partly on the financial report glowing across his tablet screen. He responded with a short comment about how property development in Manhattan had become increasingly valuable in recent years. Olivia nodded, realizing that to Ethan the project sounded like an investment opportunity rather than a creative restoration. The moment passed quietly, and the conversation moved on to the next charity event they were expected to attend together. A few nights later, something unusual happened that Ethan did notice, though he could not immediately explain why it caught his attention. As Olivia sat near the window reading, her phone vibrated softly with a new message. She glanced at the screen, and a genuine smile appeared on her face, warm and relaxed in a way Ethan had rarely seen. The expression lasted only a few seconds before she set the phone aside and returned to her book, but the brief moment lingered in Ethan's thoughts. He did not ask who had sent the message because questions about personal matters had never been part of their carefully balanced arrangement. Still, as he continued working, he realized that the quiet apartment felt slightly different that evening. Olivia seemed lighter somehow, as if a small source of happiness had entered her life from somewhere beyond the world he controlled. Ethan told himself that the observation meant nothing and returned his attention to the documents in front of him. Yet the image of that unexpected smile remained quietly in his mind, a simple moment that hinted at a change he had not yet begun to understand. The quiet change Ethan Carter had noticed that evening did not disappear. Over the following days, it began to appear again in small moments that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. The Carter penthouse remained as elegant and silent as always, its wide glass windows reflecting the endless lights of Manhattan every night. Yet Ethan slowly realized that Olivia seemed different within that familiar space. She still greeted him warmly when he returned from the office, still asked about his meetings, and still attended the formal events that were expected of them as a couple. Nothing about her behavior appeared inappropriate or disrespectful. Yet there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere between them. Olivia no longer waited in the living room for his arrival the way she used to during the early years of their marriage. Some evenings, she would already be out attending a gallery event or meeting with friends from one of the charity foundations she supported. Other nights, she returned home later than Ethan, moving quietly through the apartment with a calm confidence that seemed new. One evening, Ethan arrived home just after 9 o'clock after a long strategy meeting with international investors. As he stepped into the living room, he noticed the space was empty except for the soft glow of the city lights beyond the glass wall. Olivia was not there. He assumed she was attending another social function until he saw a short note on the kitchen counter explaining that she had gone to see the progress of a building restoration project downtown. Ethan read the note twice before placing it back on the counter. The message itself was simple and polite, but something about it stayed in his mind. During the past 2 years, Olivia had rarely gone anywhere without first discussing it with him. Now she seemed comfortable making her own plans. Ethan told himself the change was natural. After all, she was free to spend her time however she wished. Their arrangement had never included restrictions on personal activities. Still, later that evening when Olivia returned, Ethan found himself observing her more carefully than usual. She looked relaxed, her expression bright in a way he had not seen often inside the quiet walls of the penthouse. As she set her bag down near the entrance, she spoke about the progress of the renovation project she had been visiting, describing how the historic balcony was finally being restored. Her voice carried genuine enthusiasm, and she spoke about the architectural details with an energy that surprised him. Ethan nodded politely as he listened, yet he noticed that when she spoke about the project, she mentioned the architect several times. Daniel Brooks. The name appeared naturally in her explanation of the building's design choices and restoration challenges. To Olivia, the name was simply part of the story she was sharing, but to Ethan it quietly registered in his thoughts. He did not interrupt her or question her interest in the project. Instead, he returned to reviewing documents on his tablet, telling himself that there was no reason to analyze such a small detail. Yet that night, as he prepared for bed, he realized something unusual. Olivia Carter was beginning to live a life that extended beyond the carefully controlled structure of their marriage. And for the first time, Ethan felt the faintest sense of curiosity about a world he had never considered paying attention to before. The following week unfolded with the same steady pace that had always defined life inside the Carter penthouse. Yet for Ethan Carter, something subtle had begun to change beneath that familiar routine. He could not point to any single moment that felt unusual, but a quiet awareness had started to grow in his mind whenever Olivia moved through the apartment. She still behaved with the same calm politeness she had shown since the day they married. Yet Ethan found himself noticing details he had never paid attention to before. One evening after returning from another long day of meetings at Carter Dynamics, Ethan entered the living room and saw Olivia standing near the large window overlooking Central Park. The sun had already begun to set, casting soft orange light across the skyline. Olivia was speaking quietly on her phone, her voice relaxed in a way that sounded almost playful. Ethan did not intend to listen, but the peaceful tone of her conversation caught his attention. He could not hear the words clearly, only the gentle rhythm of her voice followed by a quiet laugh. When she noticed him entering the room, she ended the call politely and placed the phone on the table beside her. She greeted him the same way she always did, asking about his day and whether the negotiations with the European partners had progressed well. Ethan answered her questions calmly, yet part of his attention remained focused on the small detail he had just observed. During the 2 years of their marriage, he could not remember many moments when Olivia had laughed like that while speaking to someone else. The realization did not bother him in a dramatic way, but it stayed quietly in his thoughts throughout the evening. Later that night, as Ethan worked in his private office reviewing expansion reports, he heard Olivia moving through the living room again. She was preparing to go out for a short walk before bedtime, something she occasionally did when the weather was mild. As she passed the office door, she paused briefly and asked whether he would be working late again. Ethan replied that he needed to finish reviewing several contracts before morning. Olivia nodded understandingly and wished him a good night before leaving the apartment. After the door closed, Ethan remained seated at his desk, staring at the financial report on his screen without truly reading it. Instead, he found himself thinking about the quiet change that had entered their lives over the past few weeks. Olivia had always been respectful and patient, yet now she seemed lighter, more independent, as if a part of her life existed beyond the boundaries of their carefully structured marriage. Ethan reminded himself that this was not a problem. Their arrangement had never been based on emotional expectations, and Olivia had every right to enjoy her time however she wished. Still, the name Daniel Brooks returned briefly to his thoughts. The architect she had mentioned during dinner several nights earlier. Ethan had no reason to connect that name with the warmth he had seen in Olivia's expression, yet the two details seemed to exist together in his mind, without explanation. Outside the penthouse windows, the lights of Manhattan shimmered across the night skyline, while the city continued its endless movement below. Ethan Carter returned his attention to the documents on his desk, convincing himself that the small changes he noticed meant nothing at all. But somewhere deep within the calm certainty that had always defined his life, a quiet question had begun to form, and he had not yet realized how much that question would matter in the days ahead. Several days later, an unexpected moment began to shift Ethan Carter's quiet curiosity into something far more difficult to ignore. The afternoon had been unusually long even by Ethan's demanding standards. Negotiations with the European Technology Group had entered a delicate stage, and several executives from overseas had flown into New York for a final round of meetings. By the time Ethan left the Carter Dynamics headquarters, the sky above Manhattan had already turned deep blue, and the city lights were beginning to glow across the streets below. Instead of returning directly to the penthouse, he decided to stop at a restaurant in Midtown where he often met business partners for late dinners. The place was elegant but not overly formal, a quiet environment where conversations about investments and partnerships could continue without interruption. Ethan stepped inside and greeted the manager, who recognized him immediately, guiding him toward a table near the back of the restaurant where he could review documents while waiting for a colleague who was expected to arrive shortly. As Ethan sat down, he placed his phone beside the menu and opened a folder of financial reports. But before he could fully concentrate on the numbers, something across the room drew his attention. At a table near the large window overlooking the street, he noticed a woman whose posture and familiar silver bracelet caught his eye almost instantly. For a brief moment he assumed he was mistaken, yet as the woman turned slightly toward the soft light of the restaurant, Ethan realized it was Olivia. She looked relaxed in a simple evening dress, her hair falling naturally over her shoulders. What surprised Ethan was not simply her presence in the restaurant, but the expression on her face. She was smiling with an ease that seemed almost radiant, the kind of warm expression he had rarely seen inside the quiet space of their home. Sitting across from her was a man Ethan recognized immediately, even though they had never formally met. The man's features matched the photographs Ethan had quickly searched after hearing Olivia mention the name several times during dinner conversations. Daniel Brooks, the architect responsible for the historic renovation project Olivia had been visiting. Daniel was speaking animatedly about something, gesturing lightly with his hands as if describing a design concept. Olivia listened with bright curiosity, occasionally leaning forward as she asked questions. At one point, Daniel gently slid a small sketch across the table so she could see the design more clearly. Olivia laughed softly at one of his comments, the same natural laughter Ethan had heard briefly during her phone conversation days earlier. Ethan remained completely still in his seat, his mind absorbing the quiet scene unfolding across the room. There was nothing inappropriate about what he was witnessing. Two people sharing dinner and discussing architecture in a public restaurant was an ordinary occurrence in a city like New York. Yet something about the moment felt unexpectedly sharp in Ethan's chest. He realized that the warmth in Olivia's expression, the relaxed way she spoke and laughed, was something he had never truly experienced with her himself. For 2 years he had assumed their calm, structured arrangement worked perfectly well for both of them. Now, watching her across the restaurant table with someone else, he began to sense a possibility he had never considered before. The possibility that Olivia Carter had discovered a part of life that existed completely outside the boundaries of the marriage he believed he controlled. For several long seconds, Ethan Carter remained seated at his table without moving, his eyes fixed quietly on the scene unfolding across the restaurant. The soft lighting reflected against the polished wooden floor, and the quiet murmur of conversations filled the room, yet everything around him seemed strangely distant. His attention remained entirely focused on Olivia. She was leaning slightly forward as Daniel Brooks explained something about the restoration project, tracing a small detail across the sketch he had placed on the table between them. Olivia studied the drawing with genuine interest before looking up again with a smile that appeared effortless and natural. Ethan realized he had rarely seen her look so relaxed. For 2 years their interactions had been calm and respectful, but always careful, always controlled. Watching her now felt like observing a version of Olivia that had never existed within the carefully organized structure of their marriage. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly toward the document folder in front of him, attempting to return his attention to the financial reports he had brought to review. Yet the numbers on the page no longer held his focus. His mind kept returning to the image across the room. Daniel said something that made Olivia laugh softly again, and the quiet sound carried across the space between the tables. Ethan felt a sudden tightening in his chest, a sensation he did not immediately recognize. It was not anger exactly, nor was it fear. It was something unfamiliar, something he had never associated with his relationship before. Jealousy. The realization came slowly, almost reluctantly, as Ethan considered the possibility that the emotion existed within him at all. He had always believed emotions complicated decisions and disrupted clarity. His life had been built on discipline, logic, and control. Yet the simple scene unfolding a few yards away had disrupted that calm certainty in a way he had never expected. Olivia reached across the table to examine the corner of the sketch more closely, and Daniel turned the paper so she could see the details more clearly. Their hands brushed briefly as the page shifted between them, a small accidental moment that most people would not even notice. Ethan noticed immediately. The gesture lasted less than a second, yet it felt strangely significant to him. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the menu resting on the table. Across the room, Olivia remained completely unaware that Ethan was present in the restaurant. She was still discussing the building's design, her voice warm with curiosity as she asked Daniel how the restored balcony would connect with the new interior space. Daniel answered enthusiastically, clearly pleased that someone appreciated the artistic side of his work rather than simply evaluating the financial value of the project. Ethan watched quietly as the conversation continued. Part of him considered leaving the restaurant without revealing that he had seen them. After all, there was nothing improper about the situation. Olivia had every right to meet a friend for dinner. Their marriage had never been based on emotional exclusivity in the way most relationships were. Yet another part of him found that explanation increasingly difficult to accept. The image of Olivia smiling across the table from another man stirred a reaction that logic alone could not dismiss. Without fully deciding to do so, Ethan slowly stood from his chair. The movement felt calm and controlled on the surface, yet beneath that composed exterior something had shifted inside him. As he began walking across the restaurant floor toward the table near the window, Ethan Carter realized for the first time that the quiet arrangement he believed he had mastered might not be as simple as he once thought. Olivia was in the middle of asking Daniel another question about the restoration design when she noticed someone approaching their table. At first she assumed it was a waiter returning to refill their water glasses, but the quiet change in Daniel's expression made her glance toward the direction he was looking. When she turned her head and saw Ethan Carter standing beside the table, the warm conversation that had filled the evening paused instantly. For a brief moment Olivia simply stared at him in surprise. Ethan rarely appeared anywhere without warning, and the last place she expected to see him was this quiet restaurant in Midtown. Ethan's posture remained calm and composed as always, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his expression controlled in the same way the business world had come to recognize during negotiations and public appearances. Yet something in his eyes looked different tonight, something more focused than usual. Olivia quickly recovered from the initial surprise and stood from her chair with polite composure. "Ethan," she said softly, clearly unsure whether to treat the encounter as coincidence or something more serious. Daniel also rose from his seat out of courtesy, sensing that the man standing before them was not simply another guest in the restaurant. Ethan's gaze moved briefly from Olivia to Daniel before returning to Olivia again. For several seconds, he said nothing, as if quietly measuring the situation before deciding how to respond. Finally, he spoke in the same calm tone he used in boardrooms and negotiations. though there was a quiet firmness behind the words. I did not expect to see you here tonight. Olivia nodded slightly, still surprised, but maintaining the calm dignity she had always shown in public situations. She explained that she had met Daniel to discuss the renovation project and see the final architectural sketches before construction entered the next phase. Her voice remained respectful and composed, as if she were simply describing an ordinary dinner meeting. Ethan listened carefully without interrupting, though his eyes briefly shifted toward the sketches spread across the table. Daniel stepped forward politely and extended his hand. "Daniel Brooks," he said with a respectful tone. "I have heard a great deal about you from Olivia." Ethan looked at the offered hand for a moment before shaking it with controlled professionalism. "Ethan Carter," he replied, though the introduction was unnecessary. Daniel's expression suggested he had already recognized the name. The brief handshake ended quickly, yet the quiet tension between the three of them lingered in the air. Ethan's attention returned to Olivia. For the first time in 2 years of marriage, something inside him felt unexpectedly urgent. The thought of leaving the restaurant and pretending he had never seen them suddenly seemed impossible. He glanced again at the chair beside Olivia's table before speaking in a voice that carried a subtle authority. "Olivia," he said slowly, "you should come home with me." The words were simple, yet the meaning behind them felt heavier than the calm tone suggested. Olivia looked at him with a mixture of confusion and quiet determination. She had spent the past 2 years respecting every boundary Ethan had placed around their relationship, accepting the distance he believed was necessary. Now, hearing him suddenly claim her presence so directly, she could not ignore the contradiction. She met his gaze steadily before answering. "Come home with you," she repeated softly. Then, with calm honesty that carried more weight than any argument, she asked the question that neither of them had ever spoken aloud before. "As your wife, or as part of your contract?" The quiet words hung in the air between them, and for the first time Ethan Carter realized that the carefully controlled arrangement he had relied on for 2 years had finally reached a moment that demanded a real answer. For several seconds after Olivia asked the question, the quiet atmosphere of the restaurant seemed to freeze around them. Conversations from other tables continued softly in the background. Glasses touched against polished wood, and the faint music from the ceiling speakers drifted through the room. Yet the small space between Ethan, Olivia, and Daniel felt strangely still. Ethan Carter stood there without speaking, his eyes fixed on Olivia as her words echoed in his mind. "As your wife, or as part of your contract?" It was a question he had never expected to hear spoken aloud. For 2 years their arrangement had existed within clearly defined boundaries, polite and controlled, never requiring emotional explanations. Yet now those boundaries suddenly felt fragile. Ethan realized he could not answer immediately because the truth behind the question was more complicated than he had allowed himself to consider before. Daniel Brooks sensed the weight of the moment and stepped slightly back from the table, giving the married couple space without leaving entirely. His expression remained respectful and calm, though it was clear he understood that the conversation had become something far more personal than an architectural discussion. Olivia remained standing beside the table, her posture composed but her eyes steady as she waited for Ethan's response. She was not angry and she was not embarrassed. Instead, there was a quiet honesty in her expression, the honesty of someone who had spent a long time accepting a situation that no longer made sense. Ethan finally exhaled slowly, as if releasing a thought he had been holding for months without realizing it. His voice remained calm when he spoke, yet the tone carried something new within it. "You are my wife," he said quietly. The words were simple, but they felt different from the polite introductions he had offered at countless public events. This time the statement was not meant for reporters, investors, or strangers in a ballroom. It was meant for Olivia alone. She studied his face carefully, searching for the meaning behind the sentence. "Your wife," she repeated softly, not dismissing the words, but clearly measuring their sincerity. Ethan realized that the answer he had given was only the beginning of what she needed to hear. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to admit something that had been slowly forming in his mind since the moment he walked into the restaurant and saw her laughing across the table from another man. "Not a contract," he added after a brief pause. "My wife." Daniel remained quietly beside the table, aware that the conversation had moved beyond anything he should interrupt. Olivia glanced briefly toward him, then back to Ethan. The silence between them stretched for a moment as the weight of Ethan's words settled into the space they shared. For 2 years he had maintained a distance he believed was necessary to keep his life organized and uncomplicated. Now that distance suddenly felt unnecessary, even foolish. Ethan reached toward the back of Olivia's chair and gently moved it aside so she could step away from the table. The gesture was small, yet it carried a kind of quiet respect he had rarely shown before. Olivia hesitated for a moment, then picked up her bag from the seat beside her. Daniel offered a calm nod, understanding that the evening had reached its natural conclusion. "It was good to meet you," he said politely to Ethan before turning his attention back to Olivia. "And thank you for taking such interest in the project." Olivia thanked him warmly, promising that she still hoped to see the finished building when the renovation was complete. Then she turned toward Ethan again. As they walked together toward the restaurant exit, the city lights of Manhattan glowed beyond the glass doors. And for the first time since their marriage began, Ethan Carter understood that the quiet life he thought he had carefully controlled was about to change in ways he could no longer ignore. The cool night air of Manhattan greeted Ethan Carter and Olivia Carter as they stepped out of the restaurant and onto the softly lit sidewalk. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city moved around them in the familiar rhythm of taxis passing by, distant horns echoing between the buildings, and the quiet murmur of people walking along the street. Ethan stood beside Olivia as he signaled for the driver who had been waiting several blocks away to bring the car around. The silence between them felt different from the quiet that usually existed inside their penthouse. This silence carried questions that had been ignored for 2 years. When the black sedan arrived, Ethan opened the passenger door for Olivia, a small gesture that surprised even him because he had rarely done it before. Olivia noticed the change, but said nothing as she stepped inside the car. The drive back to the penthouse took nearly 15 minutes, yet neither of them filled the time with casual conversation. Instead, the city lights moved across the windows while both of them considered the moment that had just changed something between them. When they reached the building, Ethan followed Olivia into the quiet elevator that carried them to the upper floor, where their home overlooked the glowing skyline. As the elevator doors opened and they stepped into the penthouse, the familiar stillness returned. The living room remained exactly as it had been earlier that evening, the glass walls reflecting the lights of Central Park far below. Olivia walked slowly toward the window and placed her bag on the table before turning back toward Ethan. For the first time since they left the restaurant, she spoke. "You have never done that before," she said calmly. Ethan understood immediately what she meant. For 2 years he had maintained a careful distance from her in public spaces, a rule he believed was necessary to protect the image of control he valued so highly. Yet tonight he had walked across a restaurant and asked her to leave with him without hesitation. Ethan moved a few steps closer, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "I know," he replied quietly. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them carried more weight than any formal apology he could have offered. Olivia studied him for a moment as if trying to understand what had changed. "For 2 years you made it clear that our marriage was only an arrangement," she said gently. "You said distance made things easier." Ethan looked toward the skyline outside the window before answering. The city lights stretched endlessly into the distance, a reminder of the world he had built through logic and discipline. Yet tonight that certainty felt incomplete. "I believe that," he admitted slowly. "But tonight I realized something else." Olivia waited silently. Ethan finally looked back at her, his voice steady but more honest than it had ever been before. "I realized that seeing you build a life without me was harder than I expected." The confession hung quietly between them. Olivia did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked a few steps closer until they stood near the center of the room, beneath the soft light reflecting from the city outside. "You once told me never to touch you in public," she said gently, reminding him of the rule that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Ethan remembered the moment clearly. The crowded ballroom, the quiet firmness of his voice, and the way Olivia had accepted the rule without complaint. Without thinking further, Ethan reached forward and gently took her hand in his. The gesture was simple, yet it carried the quiet sincerity of a decision he had finally allowed himself to make. "You can touch me anywhere," he said softly. "You are my wife." Olivia looked down at their joined hands for a moment before meeting his gaze again. Outside the penthouse windows, Manhattan continued its endless movement, But inside the quiet apartment, something had finally shifted. The careful distance that once defined their marriage had begun to fade, replaced by the possibility of something real that neither of them had fully understood until this night.